At 5:14 a.m. on February 23, 1945, somewhere outside the smoldering outskirts of Cleve, Germany, Sergeant Raymond Holt pressed his forehead against the periscope of his Sherman Firefly and saw absolutely nothing. Not smoke, not fog, nothing. It was as if the battlefield had been swallowed whole by a wall of white, a blinding sheet of winter mist so dense that even the tank's headlamps bounced back into the crew's eyes like the reflection of a lantern on a frozen lake. And yet, with zero visibility, Holt whispered the order that would define his entire legacy. "Gunner, on my mark, fire." The round cracked through the fog as if cutting a hole into another world. And 7 seconds later, long after the recoil shook the entire turret, and long after Holt's loader slammed in another shell, the muffled sound of an explosion rolled back toward them. Holt's gunner, Private First Class Owens, blinked in disbelief. They had hit something they could not see, something they should not have been able to hit. Only a handful of men on the Western Front knew why Holt's crew could fire blind and still hit more targets than anyone believed possible. Fewer understood that this new ability didn't come from a factory, or from a field manual, or from any official training. It came from a crude adjustment, some would say sabotage, done in the dead of night by a man who wasn't even supposed to be touching the targeting system. But on that morning, inside that suffocating fog, the impossible shot had just proven itself real again. To understand how it happened, you have to understand Sergeant Raymond Holt. Born in 1919 in Dayton, Ohio, Holt came from a line of machinists and factory workers who lived by the rule that nothing mechanical was truly broken. It just hadn't met the right hands yet. Before the war, he fixed tractors, rewound generators, and rebuilt transmissions on cold Midwestern evenings for neighbors who paid him with apple pies and half-empty boxes of tools. So when he joined the 3rd Armored Division in 1942, they made him what he was meant to be, a tank mechanic, a man whose hands understood steel better than paperwork. By early 1945, Holt wasn't only maintaining tanks, he was living inside them. Operations Cobra, Market Garden, and the push toward the Rhine had turned the war into a brutal race of endurance and attrition. German anti-tank crews were veterans, their guns were legendary, and their camouflage positions were killing American tankers by the dozens every week. Visibility on the battlefield was rarely good. Smoke from burning farms, winter fog, mud thrown over periscopes, and the natural chaos of mechanized warfare turned tank engagements into blind duels, fought by exhausted men guessing at shapes through slits of glass. On paper, the Firefly's targeting system was adequate. In pristine conditions that never existed, it allowed accurate firing at medium range. But inside combat, Holt had seen tanks miss shots at 200 meters because the gunner simply couldn't see. German Panthers didn't have that problem. Their optics were superior, their crews experienced, their doctrine built on long-distance engagements. The Americans compensated with numbers and speed, but that didn't mean much when you couldn't even identify what you were shooting at. Then came the month of January when the fog seemed permanent and the casualty lists grew by the hour. Holt still remembered the night they lost Corporal Davies, the youngest gunner in the company. It was January 11th, Auto 709, near Geilenkirchen. Davies had tracked what he thought was a movement in a tree line. Just a shadow, just a chance. But the tank commander refused to fire. "We don't shoot what we can't see," he'd said, following the manual. 3 seconds later, a hidden Pak-40 turned Davies's Sherman into a fireball so bright it lit the frost-covered field like a sunrise. Holt could still see the reflection in the eyes of the survivors. Davies had just turned 19. He liked baseball and lemon drops. He kept his letters home folded inside his jacket even in combat. Holt never forgot that moment, or the silence in the mess tent that night, or the way the lieutenant blamed fog interference in the report, as if that explained the sickening smell of burning rubber and dreams. Everyone knew the truth. They weren't losing tanks because of bad aim. They were losing them because they had to wait to see. And the Germans weren't waiting. That was the seed of the problem no one dared touch. The Sherman's sighting mechanism had a tiny lag, barely a fraction of a second, between turret alignment and the image stabilizing through the periscope. Engineers considered it insignificant. But on muddy terrain under stress with fog thick as a blanket, that lag became lethal. Gunner adjustments drifted. Shots landed off target. Manuals dismissed the issue, calling it operator error. Reports blamed pilot inconsistency, a phrase that angered Holt every time it crossed his desk. He knew those gunners. He talked with them, worked with them, wiped grease from their faces after long nights repairing jammed turrets. These weren't operator mistakes. These were machine limitations. And it wasn't just the lag. Holt noticed something else after spending months inspecting wrecked Shermans. The internal rotation mechanism accumulated microscopic slack after repeated firing, especially when mud froze inside the bearings. That slack, a handful of millimeters, made precise adjustments nearly impossible at the exact moment when precision meant life or death. Yet the official maintenance guide insisted everything was within tolerance. That phrase would haunt him until the day he died. The breaking point came on February 3rd during a small skirmish near Kalkar. Fog so thick you could taste it. Tanks scattered across an open field, firing blind. Holt's own company lost 2 vehicles to an enemy position they never even saw. His commanding officer muttered something about unavoidable losses. Holt tightened his jaw so hard he tasted blood. He knew what needed fixing. He had known for weeks. But fixing it meant violating technical standards, rewriting calibrations, and disassembling a component the manuals told mechanics never to touch under field conditions. That night, while the rest of the camp slept or pretended to, Holt walked alone to the maintenance tent. Oil lamps hissed. A generator coughed in the corner. The cold cut through his jacket. He reached up to the Firefly's turret and placed his hand on the periscope housing. If he made the adjustment he was planning, he would be falsifying alignment records, tampering with factory equipment, and risking court-martial. But if he didn't, good men would die. Men like Davies, like Tenner from Sacramento, who used to talk about buying a Ford coupe after the war. Like Halliday, who always came back with his tank full of holes and a grin on his face as if God himself had been deflecting shells for him. Holt stood there for a long minute, breathing in the cold fumes of oil and damp metal, the silence of the camp settling heavy around him. Then he whispered to himself, maybe to the ghosts of the men he couldn't save, no more waiting to see, and he opened the toolbox. Holt began by removing the turret's elevation linkage cover, something strictly forbidden outside a certified workshop. The screws resisted from months of mud and frost, and one snapped off with a sharp metallic cry that made him freeze, listening for footsteps. None came. The generator outside groaned, masking the sound. Inside the cramped confines of the Firefly's turret, the air smelled of cold iron, solvent, and the faint sweetness of hydraulic fluid. Holt slipped off his gloves. He needed to feel the metal directly. His fingers brushed over the stabilizer gears, the tension springs, the alignment rod. He knew these parts by heart. He could have drawn them from memory, but seeing them there, fatigued, worn, with traces of grinding that the manufacturers claimed could not occur under normal battlefield use, ignited the quiet fury in him again. The heart of the issue was the microplay between the stabilizer and the gunner's optic ring. In theory, their synchronization ensured the gunner's sight aligned with the barrel's true direction. In practice, dirt and recoil created a slight lag, a human hair's width, a vibration, a shift so small that officers dismissed it the moment Holt tried to explain. But Holt had watched too many shots drift left or high. He had watched too many tanks explode because their first round missed in the fog. In tank warfare, the first shot often decided the winner, and the Shermans weren't winning. He took a flat file from his kit and began shaving down the alignment rod seat, just enough to eliminate the slack. Just enough so the stabilizer wouldn't settle in the wrong position before firing. His knuckles scraped metal. The cold amplified every sting. A drop of blood smeared onto the steel, mixing with old grease, as if the tank itself demanded an offering. Holt tightened the new fit with a reinforced bracket, cannibalized from a wrecked M4 parked behind the tent. If inspectors ever saw this, they'd demand to know why a part from a different Sherman variant had been used on a Firefly. Holt didn't care. Regulations weren't out here getting shot at. Next, he recalibrated the optic ring using a tiny adjustment screw the manual insisted should never be altered except under factory supervision. Holt turned it anyway by less than a millimeter. But that millimeter meant that when the gunner aligned his sight in zero visibility, he wouldn't be guessing. The turret and barrel would snap into place with a crisp immediacy they had never possessed before. Not drifting, not lagging, not hesitating like a tired soldier trying to remember his training. He worked for nearly an hour inside that turret, every sound amplified by the fear of being discovered. Only once did someone pass near the tent, boots crushing snow, but Holt stayed perfectly still until the footsteps faded. By the time he finished, his fingertips were numb and his breath clouded in the stale air. He wiped the tools, reassembled the housing, and climbed down with the quiet certainty of a man who had just done something irreversible. At first light, Holt sought out Owens, the gunner. Owens was 22 from Shreveport, Louisiana. He was a good shot, steady hands, calm heartbeat, but even he struggled against the limitations of the Firefly's drifting optics. Holt pulled him aside behind the row of fuel drums and said, "You're going to notice something different today." Owens frowned. "What did you do?" Holt didn't answer. "Just trust it," he said. Owens would trust Holt with his life, because every man in that company knew Holt had already saved theirs more times than they could count. The first test wasn't a grand battle. It was a reconnaissance advance near Bedburg, through a morning fog that hung like a curtain across the field. Visibility no more than 20 meters. Holt's heart pounded as Owens set his eye to the sight, and the tank moved forward, the engine rumbling beneath them. "Target. Shape ahead," the commander murmured, squinting into the nothingness. It was probably a tree, or a vehicle, or death. "Take the shot," Holt said quietly from behind Owens. Owens hesitated only a breath. Then he squeezed the trigger. The tank recoiled. The round vanished into the white void. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Then the unmistakable bloom of an explosion shook the fog into ripples. The crew stared at one another, stunned into silence. They had hit it. Whatever it was, they had hit it clean. After the mission, the commander demanded to know what Holt had changed. Holt shrugged. "Tightened tolerances," he said. Things were drifting. The commander narrowed his eyes but said nothing. They needed results, and Holt had delivered something more valuable than a new tank. He had restored the crew's confidence. Word spread. Other crews asked to borrow Holt for a few minutes. Officers turned a blind eye, pretending they didn't see the after-hours work happening in the shadows of the maintenance tent. Holt moved from tank to tank, hands blackened with oil, making the same subtle, forbidden adjustment each time. Some nights he slept only an hour. Some nights he didn't sleep at all. But the real test, the moment that would etch his name into the unspoken folklore of tank crews, came 2 weeks later. The bombardment near the Rhine began at dawn, the sky trembling under the distant thunder of artillery. German units were retreating but still deadly. Tank duels erupted across fields where ruined farmhouses stood like broken teeth. Fog and smoke intermingled until daylight felt artificial, dim and distorted. Holt was in his Firefly again, crouched beside Owens. The radio crackled with reports. Enemy armor moving through a forest line to the northeast. Panthers, at least 2. Visibility, 0. A scenario that had killed dozens of American tankers before, but not today. Owens adjusted his sight, not drifting, not waiting, and felt it. The tank responded instantly, as if the gun were an extension of his own intent. A dark shape flickered through the mist. A shadow, nothing definite. In any other battle, he would have waited. This time he didn't. He fired. The shell struck metal. The explosion echoed like a thunderclap. Holt didn't need to see it. He could hear from the radio chatter that it had been a direct hit on a Panther, breaking from the tree line. A German tank commander somewhere out in the fog was surely shouting in confusion, wondering how an American crew had fired through blindness with such surgical precision. Seconds later, Owens lined up another shot, this time at a muzzle flash. He hit that too. By the time the fog lifted slightly, 3 enemy vehicles burned across the field, and Holt's crew emerged untouched. That night, when they parked the Firefly, the men didn't cheer. They didn't brag. They simply looked at Holt with the quiet, reverent acknowledgement that only soldiers on the edge of death can give a man who has pulled them back from it. From that day on, the pattern repeated. Crews whose tanks Holt had adjusted began hitting targets earlier, more consistently, even under cover of fog or smoke. German spotters reported unexplained accuracy from American units. Radio intelligence intercepted confused messages from enemy commanders who insisted the Shermans must have received new optics or radar. But the truth wasn't in any blueprint. It was in those millimeter adjustments in the dead of night, and though officers began to suspect something unofficial was happening, no one filed a complaint. In war, results speak louder than rules. But the more Holt worked, the more he felt the weight of secrecy tightening around him. It was only a matter of time before higher command noticed the sudden transformation in accuracy and demanded answers. And the man who broke the rules to save others knew he was nearing a crossroads. Be discovered or stop now. He already knew which path he would take. By the time March rolled in, Holt's unofficial modifications had spread far beyond his own company. It started quietly, one gunner telling another that Holt did something to our sight and now the gun moves like it knows what I'm thinking. Crews from the 33rd Armored Regiment approached him in the mess tent with nervous glances, asking if he had a minute to look at something. Even a captain stopped him one afternoon, not to reprimand him but to ask, awkwardly, cautiously, Why one particular platoon's accuracy in fog had jumped by 40% in a single week. Holt always answered with the same two words: tightened tolerances. It wasn't just trust, it was survival. And quietly, beneath the surface of regulation and hierarchy, the frontline tankers formed an unspoken pact to protect him. They spread out the adjustments so it never looked like Holt did them all himself. Some claimed they'd replaced bearings. Others said they'd recalibrated sights independently. Reports became vague. Maintenance logs filled with ambiguous phrases like corrected drift, restored sensitivity, stabilizer, readjusted. Everyone knew the truth. No one wrote it down. But higher command wasn't blind. The sudden surge in hit probability under low visibility conditions reached the war room in Brussels by mid-March. Analysts circled numbers on maps. The intelligence section highlighted unusual kill reports. Shermans hitting German armor through fog banks thick enough to swallow entire platoons. Data that contradicted expectations always drew suspicion. A colonel remarked during a briefing, "Either these crews have developed a sixth sense, or the machines are being altered." That statement reached the ears of the battalion commander within days, and that's when Holt's world narrowed into a single cold, sleepless night. It happened on March 17th. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Braddock, a man famous for following doctrine with religious devotion, arrived at Holt's unit without warning. His jeep rolled in just after dusk. He didn't visit the command tent. He marched straight to the motor pool, boots crunching on gravel, coat flapping in the wind like a judge's robe. Every mechanic froze. Holt felt his stomach knot. Braddock approached the Firefly, running his gloved fingers along the turret as if feeling for guilt on the steel. Then he looked at Holt. "I hear your tanks perform miracles in fog." It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation sharpened into a blade. Holt knew he couldn't stammer or hesitate. Men like Braddock smelled fear the way wolves smelled blood. So he met the colonel's gaze and replied evenly, "We maintain them well, sir." Braddock stepped closer. "I've read the reports. Tanks hitting through zero visibility. Shots landing on the first attempt. That shouldn't happen." Holt swallowed hard. The other mechanics watched from a distance, silent, almost breathless. Braddock continued, "I'll be inspecting the calibrations personally tomorrow morning. Any irregularities, any unauthorized modifications, and I will shut this entire motor pool down. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Holt said, steady voice masking his pounding heart. That night the fog rolled in again. Thick, heavy, suffocating. It seemed to press against the walls of the maintenance tent like an omen. Holt worked alone under the dim lamp. Tools spread around him like scattered evidence. He had a decision to make. If Braddock opened the periscope housing, the modifications would be obvious. And not just obvious. Punishable. Court-martial. Imprisonment. Loss of honor, rank, and everything he had built. But if he reversed the adjustments, the tanks would drift again. Shots would miss. Crews would die. Maybe not today, but soon. Holt could almost see their faces. Owens, Tenner, Halliday, the green replacement kid from Chicago, whose hands still shook whenever the turret turned. He imagined them stumbling blindly into another fog bank, forced to wait, forced to hesitate, forced to die in silence because he had followed the rules. He slammed his fist on the steel panel so hard the lamp trembled. The rage was cold, not hot, the kind of fury that grows inside a man who has buried too many friends because someone far from the front insisted that manuals mattered more than survival. Holt didn't undo the modifications. Instead, he made them cleaner. He opened the turret, wiped every mark, smoothed every file cut, polished away every visible trace of improvised engineering. He replaced screws with factory-look spares, repainted scratch lines, realigned seams so perfectly that no one without his hands-on experience could recognize they had ever been moved. He cleaned away fingerprints, grease patterns, anything Braddock could point to. By the time he finished, dawn was creeping into the sky, soft and cold. Braddock arrived with 2 inspection officers at Oro 640. Holt stood at attention beside the Firefly, eyes burning from lack of sleep. The colonel climbed into the turret, flashlight in hand. Every creak of metal felt like a nail driven into Holt's spine. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. Then Braddock emerged, expression unreadable. "No irregularities," he said. Holt released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But Braddock wasn't finished. "You are good with your hands, Sergeant. Too good. Something is happening in this battalion, and I intend to find out what. If I discover that anyone has been modifying Army equipment without authorization," he let the threat hang in the air like a noose, "there will be consequences." He walked away, and Holt realized the danger wasn't over. It was growing. 2 days later, the battalion was thrown into another engagement, this one near the outskirts of Wesel. The Germans were desperate, launching counterattacks to delay the Allied advance toward the Rhine. Fog clung to the fields. Smoke billowed from burning farmhouses. Tanks maneuvered at close range, silhouettes appearing and vanishing like ghosts. It was the perfect test, and the perfect trap. If Holt's modifications truly made Sherman's deadlier in fog, the results would show immediately, and Braddock, watching from his command vehicle, would know. The Firefly rolled forward at 8:12 a.m., engine growling, treads chewing into the wet soil. Holt crouched in the turret beside Owens, the two exchanging a glance that carried both fear and resolve. The radio crackled with tension. Somewhere ahead, Panthers were advancing under the cover of fog. The commander whispered, "Be ready. They're close." Owens steadied his hands on the grip. The sight responded with that instantaneous precision Holt had carved into the machine with blood and sleepless nights. A muzzle flash flickered, nothing more than a brief orange pulse in the white haze. Owens reacted. He fired. The explosion that followed was unmistakably a kill. Holt didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He only felt the truth settle cold in his gut. Braddock had seen it. The radio erupted with stunned voices. Direct hit. How the hell did they? No visibility. That was blind. Braddock's voice cut through. Crew of that Firefly. Report immediately after the engagement. Owens swallowed hard. We're finished. No, Holt said quietly. Not yet. Minutes later, another target revealed itself. This time only the rattling echo of treads and the faint outline of a turret. Owens fired again. Another clean hit. The battlefield shifted. American tanks advanced with renewed ferocity. German crews hesitated, unnerved by the sudden accuracy of the Shermans. Holt could almost imagine a Panther commander somewhere shouting, "They can see us through the fog." But they couldn't see. They could feel. They could react instantly, because Holt had given them back the precious milliseconds that the factory had stolen. After the battle, Holt climbed down from the Firefly slowly, knowing each step brought him closer to Braddock's judgment. The colonel approached with a face carved from stone. "Sergeant Holt," he said, voice quiet and dangerous. "Explain." Holt stood silently for a moment, listening to the distant crackle of burning tanks, smelling the acrid scent of steel and smoke. Then he opened his mouth to speak. Holt didn't answer immediately. The words formed slowly, like gears grinding inside a machine that had been pushed too far for too long. He glanced around the battlefield, the still settling fog, the silhouettes of burning Panthers, the Firefly's barrel still warm from firing. Men moved across the field with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, unaware that the fate of their unspoken guardian hung by a thread. Finally, he met Braddock's eyes. "Sir," Holt said quietly, "I did what was necessary." Braddock's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply waited, as though allowing the confession to grow heavier in the air. Holt continued, "Our tanks weren't keeping up. The optics drifted. Stabilizer slack caused delays. In fog, seconds kill. Our men were dying because the equipment wasn't responding fast enough." Braddock's expression remained unreadable. A faint wind stirred his coat, blowing smoke and frost across the steel carcass of a German tank in the distance. "So," Braddock said slowly, "you took it upon yourself to alter government property, to violate technical specifications, to rewrite calibrations authorized only for factory personnel?" Holt didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." Braddock exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound somewhere between disbelief and frustration. "Do you realize what that means, Sergeant? Do you realize the position you've put this battalion in?" "Sir," Holt replied, voice steady, "I watched Corporal Davies burn alive because he didn't fire first. I watched tanks get hit before they even had a chance to react. I knew what the problem was, and I knew no one from the factories was coming out here to fix it." Braddock stepped closer, lowering his voice until only Holt could hear. "War is not the place for improvisation," he said. Holt didn't blink. "With respect, sir," he answered softly, "war is exactly the place for improvisation. It's the place where manuals die." For the first time, Braddock's mask cracked, not with anger, but with a flicker of something more complicated. Doubt, conflict, a quiet recognition that Holt wasn't wrong, but Braddock was still a man of doctrine, raised in the kind of military thinking where rules preserved order and order preserved armies. Men like Holt, men who broke the rules to save lives, were dangerous. Necessary perhaps, but dangerous. As essential to victory as they were troublesome to command. Braddock turned away, staring out across the fog-layered field where German and American armor smoldered side by side. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. Tell me exactly what you changed. Holt hesitated. This was the moment. He could hide behind vague phrases, claim minor repairs, say nothing, but he chose the truth. I eliminated the microplay and the stabilizer alignment, he said. Filed down the rod seat, reinforced the bracket with a part from a wrecked M4, readjusted the optic ring tension. Braddock stiffened. You altered the optic ring? Yes, sir. That is strictly. I know, Holt interrupted. But it works. Braddock wheeled around. Working is not the point. Then what is the point, sir? Holt asked, voice unwavering. Is the point to obey the manual, or to keep our men alive? A silence stretched between them, thick as the fog around their boots. Finally, Braddock spoke in a voice quieter than Holt expected. You do realize I could court-martial you on the spot? Holt nodded. Yes, sir. And yet you admit all of this openly? Yes, sir. Why? Holt didn't answer right away. He looked at Owens, at the younger crews, at the medics pulling wounded men from tanks, at the chaplain walking with his head bowed through the smoke. Then he answered, because if I lie, the truth dies here with me, and men will keep dying with it. Braddock turned away again, rubbing his temples as though trying to massage order into chaos. He stood in silence for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, the tone had shifted. You realize I can't approve this. I'm not asking you to approve it, Holt said. I'm asking you not to undo it. Braddock exhaled slowly, the cloud of his breath curling into the cold air. Sergeant Holt, he said, what you have done is reckless, insubordinate, potentially disastrous if mishandled. Holt braced himself for the inevitable. But, Braddock continued, I would be lying if I said I hadn't noticed the results. Holt's breath caught slightly. Braddock walked closer, lowering his voice again. Your Firefly destroyed 3 German tanks in fog today. Blind. Clean hits. Our intelligence officers are baffled. Enemy units reported being targeted as if the Americans could see through smoke. That kind of advantage changes battles, Sergeant. Holt didn't respond. The colonel wasn't finished. I should shut this down. I should make an example of you. Braddock paused. But I won't. Holt blinked in surprise. Braddock leaned in. Not because I agree with what you did. Not because I condone breaking doctrine. But because we are crossing the Rhine soon. And I need every crew alive to do it. Holt nodded slowly. Braddock continued. You will not perform any more modifications. Holt understood the words, but the colonel wasn't done. Unless one of my officers specifically requests maintenance work. Off the record. The message was clear. Braddock wasn't giving permission. He was giving silence. And Sergeant, Braddock added, if anyone asks how these tanks became so precise, you say nothing. You keep your name out of it. You keep your hands clean in the paperwork. Holt nodded again, this time with a different weight on his shoulders. Braddock straightened his coat. Dismissed. As Holt walked away, Owens intercepted him. What happened? Owens whispered, eyes wide with expectation. Holt allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. We keep going, he said simply. That night, under the dim lights of the motor pool, Holt didn't modify any tanks, but he supervised. Quietly, indirectly. Mechanics from 3 companies drifted in and out of the tent, carrying toolkits, whispering questions, checking alignment rods and optic rings with the subtlety of practiced conspirators. They were building something the manuals could never describe. A frontline network of men bound not by protocol but by the instinct to survive. And as more tanks received the subtle adjustments, always without record, always with fingerprints wiped clean, a change swept through the battalion. Reports of unexpected long-range accuracy in fog became routine. German units hesitated to use mist as cover. Panther and Jagdpanzer crews who once relied on invisibility began to distrust the very fog that had shielded them for years. American tank commanders noticed too. One night, Captain Fulton approached Holt with a folded map in hand. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, but even he couldn't hide the awe in his voice. We're seeing something out there, he said. Something different. It's like the tanks respond before the gunners finish thinking. Holt said nothing. Fulton continued. I don't know what you did. I don't want to know. But you may have just turned fog from our enemy into our ally. Holt looked toward the row of Shermans, their silhouettes resting under the cold moonlight like sleeping beasts waiting for dawn. It wasn't me, he said quietly. It was necessity. But Fulton wasn't fooled. You saved men today, Holt. You saved a lot of men. Holt didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he lacked words, but because something deeper welled up inside him. A tiredness, a recognition that he had crossed a boundary he could never uncross, the kind of burden only mechanics, medics, and men who bend rules to preserve life truly understand. War moved on. The Rhine crossing loomed, and Holt knew one truth with absolute clarity. Once the river was behind them, once Germany lay open, once the tanks rolled east toward the final battles of the war, everything he had done would disappear into silence, because history didn't record the names of men who tightened bolts at midnight. It only recorded the victories their hands made possible.